Hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for our panel discussion on the use of criminal law to address violence and discrimination against LGBT people. My name is Neela Ghoshal, Associate Director of the LGBT Rights Program at Human Rights Watch, and I'll be moderating this discussion today. During this conversation, we'll be grappling with the tensions that arise as advocates and policymakers recognize the need to address anti-LGBT violence, discrimination, and bias, but also recognize the limitations and challenges that come with the use of criminal law and the way in which the criminal law itself can be used as a tool of repression, and in which punitive measures in particular can jeopardize a wide range of human rights. We're joined today by Ryan Thoresen from Human Rights Watch, Melanie Judge from the University of Cape Town, Jason Wu from Gapimni, Empowering Queer and Trans Asian Pacific Islanders, and Estefania Velabarba from Intersecta. I'm going to start by introducing Ryan and posing the first question. Ryan is a researcher at Human Rights Watch who has focused primarily in his work on human rights abuses against LGBT children, particularly in school settings in the United States, the Philippines, and South Korea. He's also looked at discrimination against trans people in the United States and on issues like access to healthcare and adoption for LGBT people, also in the US. Ryan is also the author of a forthcoming paper on what he describes as discriminalization, or the use of criminal law to address discrimination, in this case against LGBT people. And he's been thinking about these challenges of using criminal law to respond to discrimination and how we should understand that approach from a human rights perspective. So Ryan, I'd like to start by asking if you could give us a little bit more context about the use of criminalization to respond to anti-LGBT violence and discrimination around the world. Where and why are advocates of LGBT rights turning to criminalization as a response? And what are some of the human rights arguments that we're seeing mobilized on both sides of the debate? The idea that we need more criminal law to respond to this type of abuse, or the idea that perhaps we need less criminal law?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So I think, historically, sexual and reproductive rights advocates have really struggled with criminalization. And we've spent a lot of our time as advocates working on LGBT rights, sex worker rights, abortion, or HIV, arguing against the use of criminal punishment to police behavior. In part, I think that's because we think that these underlying behaviors shouldn't be penalized, but we're also often very critical of the ways that criminalization threatens human rights. The ways that it's inherently restrictive of human rights, but also the ways that criminal law can be enforced in a discriminatory manner or have kind of collateral consequences for people's rights. And we've seen some pushback against the use of criminal law by feminists and racial justice advocates who recognize that criminalization can be a harmful intervention in a variety of ways. But increasingly, we've been seeing LGBT rights advocates and sometimes zealous lawmakers who are really enthusiastic about kind of committing to LGBT equality, pushing for criminal penalties for anti-LGBT discrimination. So as of 2019, there are about 74 countries around the world that prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation. And many of those prohibit discrimination based on gender identity as well. At least 26 of those countries do so using the criminal law with punishment up to and including time in prison. And sometimes there are things like fines and other penalties that can be levied under those laws, but they at least permit people to be imprisoned for things like employment discrimination or discrimination in public accommodations. In 39 countries around the world, we have laws that criminalize incitement to hatred, violence, or discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And at least 10 of those laws include provisions that criminalize degrading or insulting speech, even when it doesn't amount to kind of immediate incitement to violence or discrimination. And we see other countries considering similar bills as they're kind of combating discrimination against LGBT people. And then finally, there are a handful of jurisdictions that are now prohibiting conversion practices or efforts to change a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. And some of these countries have used incarceration as a penalty for these practices, including Malta, Germany, Ecuador, and Taiwan. And there's real momentum behind criminal bans in other parts of the world, with Canada, the UK, and other countries considering criminal restrictions in the current day. And so the arguments for criminalization in these contexts are that discrimination and conversion practices do inflict real harm on people. And that could be economic harm, it could be psychological harm, and sometimes it's physical harm. And for many LGBT advocates, it makes sense for the state to address that harm using criminal law. And that's true of other movements as well. If we look at anti-discrimination laws that include incarceration as a penalty, typically the laws that exist also criminalize discrimination based on race, religion, or other factors. But there are also arguments against criminalization, and I think that reasons why human rights advocates might want to take a moment and pause before they push for criminal penalties. A lot of the pushback to these laws has focused on whether they infringe on the freedom of speech or freedom of religion. And that's a very vibrant debate, and I'll kind of set that aside for a minute. I think that even if we recognize that discrimination or hate speech or conversion practices do inflict some kind of harm, we still might be worried about incarceration for separate reasons. And there's three reasons that I think we could about that as human rights advocates. First is that I think it isn't always clear that criminalization works, and particularly criminalization as a penalty after the fact. Fines and civil penalties, as well as restorative measures like apologies or mediation, can also be effective and really restorative for people who are victims of discrimination. At the very least, I think it's important to think of criminal bans as part of a larger strategy. They're designed to kind of exact punishment after the fact, but it isn't always clear that they're effective as a deterrent to prevent conduct from taking place, especially where it's nonviolent conduct. And when we talk about ending discrimination, I think we also need to be thinking about ending the conditions that give rise to it. So to the extent that bans exist, it's important to also be thinking about proactive solutions, remedies for survivors, and good models that we can look to. And one that I like to kind of talk about is the Comprehensive Trans Rights Bill that passed a few years ago in Uruguay, where the government set aside 1% of government jobs for trans applicants for 15 years, had policies to facilitate legal gender recognition, expanded access to gender-affirming healthcare, and provided a special pension for trans people who had been abused under the country's military dictatorship. And I think that thinking about kind of a package of protections that help to ameliorate historical discrimination is a really important intervention. Second, I think incarceration and sometimes the use of criminal law more broadly puts a range of human rights at risk. It's a deprivation of liberty, often in substandard conditions that human rights advocates are very critical of, and that can amount to torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. We often see collateral consequences of criminalization that make it more difficult for people to find employment, housing, maintain a family. Criminalization often puts people under surveillance for life with reporting regimes or other things that require them to kind of check in the long term. And we also know that criminal law is often enforced in a discriminatory manner. And there's a real concern that people who are likely to be targeted under hate speech laws or other laws can be the most marginalized members of society, including migrants, racial minorities, and religious minorities, and people who can't afford legal help. And then third and finally, I think there's a real risk that criminalization can also be used against LGBT people. And examples of this are really common. If we think of, there was a recent case in Poland where an activist was arrested and charged for offending religious beliefs for distributing posters of the Virgin Mary with a rainbow halo. Or in Turkey, students have been arrested and charged with disrespect for posters depicting Mecca alongside LGBT flags. And so when we as advocates are arguing for offensive speech to be punishable by law, we need to really grapple with what that means to extend that protection to other groups as well, including religious minorities, and whether we're comfortable with criminalization being widely used in other contexts. And so that's just some of the kind of preliminary concerns that we've been thinking about from a human rights perspective. And yeah, we'd be really interested in what the rest of the panel thinks.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Apologies, forgot to unmute briefly. Thank you for that very comprehensive overview. I really appreciate the analysis of all of the potential consequences of criminalization. And I think back to the first time that I walked into a prison and thought to myself, I wouldn't wish this on very many people. And as human rights advocates, we need to be really careful and thoughtful and deliberate about whether we're wishing those kinds of conditions on anybody, if there are other potential alternatives available to address the harms that we're dealing with. And so I think that many people in the human rights community might agree that things like incarceration should perhaps be reserved for the most severe forms of violence. And I want to turn to Melanie, because Melanie is working in an environment in which we are seeing what all of us would agree is quite severe violence. That is in South Africa, where Melanie is looking at approaches to addressing violence against Black lesbians, among others. But let me start by introducing Melanie. Melanie Judge is a queer and feminist scholar and activist. She's an adjunct associate professor of public law at the University of Cape Town. Melanie is also a trustee of the Gala Queer Archive, and she's the author of Blackwashing Homophobia: Violence and the Politics of Sexuality, Gender, and Race. Melanie is also a regional consultant to UNDP's Inclusive Governance Initiative to advance LGBTI rights and inclusion in sub-Saharan Africa. And as I was just mentioning, Melanie has been looking very closely at this phenomenon of severe violence against LGBT people, specifically Black lesbians, but also others in South Africa. And there's quite a fierce debate going on around the scope of hate crimes legislation in South Africa and how that legislation could or should be used to enhance penalties or to otherwise address violence against queer people. Melanie, can you talk about how the considerations that Ryan spoke about have influenced your thinking about how to protect LGBT people from violence and where we make use of criminal law?
Great, thanks Neela, very much. And first, thanks to Human Rights Watch for the opportunity to participate in what I think is a very timely conversation. I think, as is very well known, the violent systems of colonialism and apartheid in South Africa have caused LGBTI people great suffering, particularly at the hands of punitive and punishing legal regimes where Black and queer people historically were effectively criminalized. And yet, in the democratic period, there's been a steady turn towards more punitive law to punish others in an attempt to tackle, in particular, very extremely high levels of sexual and gender-based violence. Importantly, of course, advocacy and litigation for better laws, and I think for explicitly naming discrimination as unlawful, even when law alone cannot stem it, has been critical to the social transformation project in South Africa. So as a result, in the democratic era, the right to equality and non-discrimination, as we know, are constitutionally entrenched. And as such, equality before the law is about being able to enjoy the benefit and protection of law, which includes prohibitions on discriminations based on sexual orientation, gender, and race, amongst other grounds. But the question, I think, has been, what forms should such prohibitions take? And do those forms actually move us closer to substantive justice and equality more broadly? And I think here a key concern is whether punitive legal measures against LGBTI-related discrimination can help address the structural and systemic conditions that perpetuate such discrimination and its accompanying violences. And I'm particularly concerned here with how this turn to punitive laws might deflect away from other critical actions necessary to advance a wide range of rights and redistributions more fully. Of course, legal consequence for discrimination, I would argue, is necessary to build rights-based cultures. This is particularly the case because institutionalized practices, both in public and private settings, continue to deny LGBTI persons access to healthcare, education, employment, religious and cultural community, and to other spheres of social, economic, and political life. However, a narrow emphasis on criminalizing anti-LGBTI practices can prevent a more expansive and inclusive view of what constitutes violence and safety, and indeed for whom. Also, criminalizing social problems may obscure the source of these problems because punitive measures often disproportionately impact those who are already racially and economically marginalized. So the growing emphasis on criminal law, I think in part links to an over-reliance on law enforcement as a kind of a way of managing social relationships. This is somewhat ironic because state security forces and the criminal justice system itself are often sources of violence and exclusion for LGBTI persons, for Black persons, for women. Particularly in other parts of Africa, where rights-based laws and policies are weak or non-existent, criminalization strategies can actually strengthen the authoritarian tendencies of the state, when what is perhaps more needed is to make law enforcers increasingly accountable to a rule of law that has human rights at its core, at its center. And I think here African feminists have really drawn strong attention to how histories of state violence shape the contemporary relationship between gender and violence. That said, I'm not suggesting that the state be absolved of its obligation to act against prejudice. Rather, I'm cautioning that as we place demands for protection before the state, it is essential to consider how juridical power is itself implicated in violent dominations based on race, gender, sexual, and class hierarchies. And in taking this into consideration, the challenge is then to resist hate violence and state violence at the same time. And I think that requires us understanding how both are linked to the exercise of punitive and correctional control. To tackle cultures of prejudice and inequality in South Africa specifically, we also have the Equality Court, which offers a range of legal remedies that are non-criminal and have a restorative dimension. So these courts give effect to constitutional obligations to prevent unfair discrimination and to promote human dignity and equality. They're non-adversarial in approach, and they provide a wide range of remedies that are community-oriented and structural. So the recourse this court offers has been characterized as both backward-looking, for example, through compensation and conditional apologies after the fact, and forward-looking, such as orders preventing further harm and special measures to address the breach of the rights in question, and in some cases to refer matters on for criminal prosecution. So in this way, the Equality Court is geared towards addressing discrimination at a more systemic level, and I think has the potential to advance longer-term reform of social structures, as well as the education of offenders. However, despite this novel forum, which has been in existence since the early 2000s, this opportunity to use the specialized court to tackle discrimination, including on the basis of sexual orientation and gender, there are also more recent moves to criminalize hate speech through the introduction of hate crimes legislation. So the new Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Bill that's currently before the South African Parliament creates a criminal offense of hate speech that could effectively see first-time offenders being sentenced to up to 3 years in prison, the kinds of prisons that you were referring to, Neela, earlier. And I think one of the things that I've been interested in is critiquing this paradigm of hate crimes legislation, which in a sense tends to approach prejudice as a discrete set of individualized acts that are caused by internal beliefs or sentiments of what we call mad and bad people. And I think this is decontextualized, and I think it tends to overlook the histories, the structures, and the powers by which certain groups come to be the hated, and others come to use hate to assert and secure their privilege. And then just to draw into a close, because I think modalities of crime and punishment largely rely on these types of understandings of hate and hated, the passing of more punitive laws will not necessarily end systemic racism, patriarchy, or trans and homophobia. And so in a sense, the broad context I've described, I think, provokes some bigger questions that need to be grappled with in trying to address anti-LGBTI discrimination and violence. And let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Melanie, for that structural analysis and unpacking the need to address the systemic factors that feed into this kind of violence. Of course, inherent in the use of criminal law is that criminal law targets individuals, and the individuals who are performing the acts of violence and discrimination and bias that we're speaking about are not necessarily the individuals wielding the most power in society or those who have the opportunity to shift the narrative in the way that a state does if it uses its powers more imaginatively. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to turn to Jason Wu. Jason is a lawyer with the Legal Aid Society and a community activist in New York, where they are currently co-chair of GAPIMNI, Empowering Queer and Trans Asian Pacific Islanders. They also write extensively about race, intersectionality, and the law in forums such as Truth Out and Teen Vogue. So Jason, what I would like to ask you to start off with is, as a queer racial justice advocate, you've surely been in many conversations in the United States about the use of hate crimes legislation, which a number of marginalized communities in the US have turned to as a potential solution for some of the violence that we experience. What are the debates that you are witnessing and participating in about the use of hate crimes legislation within racial justice movements, where I think there are a lot of parallels to the conversations happening in queer movements around the globe?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. And I'm really honored to be on this panel with such great speakers. Makes my job a lot easier going after Ryan and Melanie. So I'm streaming in from the ancestral lands of the Lenape people, also known as New York City. And I want to start with that because I want us to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that have brought us here today. As we talk about hate crimes and violence, this is happening against a backdrop of systemic violence against Indigenous people, anti-Blackness, and colonial wars. I start with this because I think that in order for us to understand the problem and to come to solutions that can really address these problems, we need to understand this broader context, this historical context, and so forth. As noted earlier, violence is more than just interpersonal violence. It's more than just interpersonal attacks between individuals, although that is a real issue and that is a real problem that affects queer and trans people. There's also been an escalation of anti-Asian violence in the United States. But these things are not just individual problems between individual people. It's tied to systemic violence and state violence. And so we have to understand the connections between the individual and the systemic. I think that, a quote that I always go back to is by Angela Davis, where she says, "Prisons do not disappear social problems, they disappear human beings. Homelessness, unemployment, drug addiction, mental illness, and illiteracy are only a few of the problems that disappear from public view when the human beings contending with them are relegated to cages." And I turn to this quote because I think it really summarizes a lot of the opposition to hate crimes legislation and the reliance on carceral approaches to interpersonal violence in our society. Much of what we're seeing is in relation to inequality. It's not to say that's all that it is, but it is a big part of the issues that we're grappling with. And so in order to truly address the root causes of violence in our society, not just the symptoms, we have to be able to address these larger systemic inequalities in our society. As Ryan also noted earlier, much of the criminal legal system is reactive. The police show up after someone has been harmed, after violence has been committed, after a mass shooting has happened. The prosecutors are showing up afterwards to levy hate crimes charges, and the prisons and sentencing and all of that is also after the fact, after the violence and harm has been committed. I would also say that none of these criminal laws address the immediate needs of victims, the survivors, or their families. If you've been attacked and you need healthcare, the criminal legal system does not give you healthcare. If you have lost a loved one due to violence, the criminal legal system does not provide your family with income that you have lost because someone you loved has been killed. So many of these attacks that are happening They're also happening in some of the most heavily policed cities and jurisdictions in the world, including in New York City and Times Square. And I think that we have to understand the issue of violence is not a matter of a shortage of police or prisons. And quite frankly, the police shoot and kill approximately 1,000 people every year in the United States. And that is why we've seen this resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. It's an ongoing struggle that disproportionately impacts Black communities and queer and trans people and many other marginalized communities here in the United States. I think it's also important to underscore that not all of us, not all queer and trans people are experiencing these forms of violence in the same way. Not all of us are vulnerable in relation to the state in the same way. And so as we're thinking about the solutions and as some people are calling for more carceral strategies, we have to understand the impact of these calls on Black and Brown communities, poor communities, and also immigrants, trans people, sex workers. We are not all situated in relation to the state in the same way. And so when we are impacted by harm, we have there are different strategies and options and remedies available. And also carceral strategies oftentimes place the most vulnerable within our communities in greater danger. So I think that, we really need a conception of justice or solutions to violence that go beyond hate crimes legislation and more criminalization. We need solutions that address harm, that address the root causes, that conceives of safety as more than just policing and prisons. I want to just also uplift a couple of names and stories because I think it's important for us not to just abstractly talk about these issues. I want to uplift the name of Ashley Diamond, who is a Black transgender woman and prisoners' rights activist. She's currently incarcerated in Georgia. She was re-imprisoned because of technical parole violation, and she's faced repeated sexual assault, denial of healthcare, which has only been exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic. Hate crimes legislation does not help her. I also want to uplift the name of Roxana Hernandez, which many of you may remember. She was a 33-year-old transgender woman from Honduras. She died in 2018 after 16 days in the custody of Customs and Border Patrol and Immigration Customs Enforcement. She was placed in a freezing cold holding cell. And after a week, she was transferred to Chabola County Correctional Facility and then to New Mexico Hospital, where ICE claimed she died of cardiac arrest. She was also HIV positive and denied the medical care she needed. She was seeking asylum. Hate crimes legislation, the carceral system did not help her. And prior to Roxana, I also want to uplift the name of Victoria Arellano, who died in 2007. She was a Mexican immigrant who died from complication of AIDS while in the custody of ICE. In her final days, she was cared for by fellow inmates at the facility who took turns helping her go to the bathroom. And she was vomiting blood. 80 detainees protested when she was not receiving health care. She was then transported to hospital and returned back to the facility within 24 hours. She was then very sick again and transported back to the hospital in San Pedro, where she was handcuffed to her bunk and guarded by 2 immigration agents. She was 23 years old when she died. And so I share these stories because these are members of our LGBTQ+ community who are often ignored and erased. I share their stories because the criminal legal system, including hate crimes legislation, does not serve, protect, or help these women in our communities. We have to have a much more expansive understanding of violence and safety, and we need real resources and investments to address the root causes and uplift the most vulnerable within our communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Jason, particularly for highlighting incidents in which the state is itself the perpetrator of violence. And as we all know, this happens to LGBT people and people of color, even in states that claim to be upholding the rights of those people. And so there's a real urgent need for states to examine their own behaviors and the ways that they contribute to hate and violence. I want to turn to Estefania. Estefania Vela Barba is the executive director of Intersecta, a feminist research and advocacy organization committed to ending gender discrimination in Mexico. Estefania has worked on a number of issues in this context, including employment discrimination, as well as violence and fatal violence. Estefania, violence against women is an urgent concern for feminists in Mexico. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about how media and social movements have approached gender-based violence and how this kind of discourse has shaped conversations across movements in Mexico around the use of criminalization as a tool to address this kind of violence.
Thank you so much. And just, bouncing back on what Jason said, and so criminalization here in Mexico, it's one of the basic go-to strategies to solve most social problems, right? Whenever a group, a movement highlights that there is an X problem that needs to be addressed, the state quickly makes it a crime, and that's the solution. If you actually look at the bills being passed, there's generally a typical paragraph that goes something like, we know that this is not enough, but this is nonetheless important, right? And I say this because one of the most common things that is said in Mexico is that this doesn't work. As Jason's own stories show, this doesn't work. But the narrative that is pushed by media and by most social movements is that, of course, it doesn't work because there is impunity. What we need to do is fix impunity, and then it will work. So this is very, the example of Mexico, and if you look at the history of the narrative around impunity, everybody knows that the police doesn't work the way it's supposed to work. Everybody knows that prison doesn't work the way it's supposed to work, but we cannot let go of the dream that if we train them well enough, that if we make some tampering here and there, and if we all become sort of like these watchdogs of the criminal justice system, magically one day it will work the way we want it to work, and it will punish the way we want it to punish, and it will bring justice to those that we wanted to bring justice to. And I say this because it's very challenging to be, number one, I didn't mention this, but of course it is important. Mexico is a country with incredibly high rates of violence. Violence has exploded, particularly in the last 15 years. There was an almost doubling of the number of murders, tripling, I'm sorry, of murders happening. So on average, 100 people are killed in the country every day. So the entire conversation about challenging criminalization has to be dealt with the fact that you have a grave and important crisis. That's number one. Number two, there is this problem that has been articulated as the problem of impunity. So part of the challenge is how to acknowledge that that is a problem, but that is not the only problem about criminalization, that even if you invest all these resources and all this training, the system is set up in a way where that is its point. And I find this conversation incredibly important because obviously in Mexico, for example, we look at the case of the United States with the entire conversation about police brutality in the last years. And the point of activists is you have been talking about police reform for over 20, 30 years. We have tinkered with the system. We have sent them to training. We have made committees of citizenships. When are we just going to be like, this doesn't work? We need other ways to address it. I know it doesn't, but I think that's the seduction. Most people know it doesn't work, but we can't seem to be able to give it up. And this is something that we do. So generally the state fails. Generally laws don't work. Part of being an engaged citizen and part of being an engaged activist is sort of like, how do we make things better? And saying that with criminal law, it's most likely that you should just kind of like abandon that and truly leave it for like the worst case scenarios. And even in those worst case scenarios, there's probably a whole other things that you could do. And I also find this important. And because this panel, violence exists, extreme violence exists. It is something that we're all against. It is something that we don't want. But if I have to say, is that the big three questions is, how do we address this violence? And I think both Ryan and Melanie said this was everybody's point. It's not just about addressing violence, recognizing violence. And I think this is where we're stuck. And criminalization, that's the big thing it offers, right? So there's this entire narrative about how criminal law is the ultimate mechanism for the state to recognize harm. If you manage to get into the criminal code, the state is finally saying that you are worth it, you are dignified, your life is valuable. And that is how we justify in a lot of ways that criminal law has not only not given us value, but it has persecuted us. So now we wanted to address us. Now we want us to recognize it. But the second question that I think everybody touched upon is, how do you redress violence? And criminal law is just imprison an individual person. There is generally no redress. But the third one is, how do you actually reduce? And I say this, and I know on the second round, but a lot of our work at Intersecta is trying to figure out everything, and Melanie said this in a very clear way. When we look at criminal law, what are we missing? And once you get out of criminal law, you realize you are literally missing on everything. You could be doing so many other things to not only address and redress, but reduce, which I think is one of the most, it's what we want. We don't want the after the fact. We no longer want to remember names. We want to have people with us. That is our goal. So I know I'm rambling, but that is the media narratives, going to the question, that is the criminal law seduction, where it's not that people don't know it doesn't work. Is that we think we can make it better. And 30, 40, 50 years later, here we are. And the examples of how this fails, and not only fails, but to Ryan's point, it has unintended consequences on the groups that we say we're trying to uphold and bolster and guarantee their rights. It just keeps piling up and piling up. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Yes, Estefania, thank you so much. Not rambling at all. Those are really critical points. We don't want to remember any more names. We don't want to lift up any more names of the dead, right? So it's very easy for a government to sign a law that says people are going to get 50 years in prison for a particular crime. It doesn't bring the people back. And I think questions we need to ask ourselves are around, is the state investing in anti-bullying practices? Is the state investing in comprehensive sexuality education? Is the state investing in addressing economic marginalization of our communities? And are all of those things being hidden behind the veil of criminalization? I want to turn back to Melanie and ask about the very specific policy reforms that are being discussed in South Africa right now. What are some of the challenges and the competing pressures that you're experiencing in working toward specific solutions to these problems and specific policy recommendations?
Thanks very much. I must say I'm very invigorated by the other panelists, and I think there's some interesting convergences which I hadn't anticipated, which is really great. So thanks so much for your inputs. I mean, I think for me, what's really important is to almost take stock on this issue of alternatives, in the sense that, you know, feminist, queer, and anti-racist activists have very smartly demonstrated how to mobilize for forms of justice and accountability that hold individual perpetrators to account, and at the same time seek to transform the social orders that entrench heteropatriarchal and racialized abuses of power. So we've seen some of those practices already. I think the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement are showing these multiple forms of justice in the streets, in the boardrooms, in the media, etc. And part of this is about challenging cultures of prejudice, which, of course, directly to your question, Leela, policy and law does some of that, but there's more rigorous work in other spaces to be done. And here we know, as Jason has rightly said, that the struggles for sexual, gender, and racial justice are inextricably linked. And in a sense, one without the other, or dare we see one pitted against the other, simply does not lead to safer and healthier communities at large. We also know, as others have said, that criminal law cannot substantively transform the set of social arrangements that continue to produce sexist, homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic, racist hate speech and violence. So with that in mind, for me, the question is how might we focus on the role and potential of alternative institutionalized mechanisms for accountability, such as constitutional bodies, national human rights institutions, ombud structures, alternative dispute resolution processes, and of course, specialized courts that utilize non-criminal remedies, as I was referring to earlier. So here, in a sense, I'm arguing for, and I've said this before, to Human Rights Watch, for broadening the remedial repertoires that we turn to in seeking to counter discrimination. So instead of an over-reliance on criminal law, which of course is very attractive, as Estefania was saying, it is about recognition, and we get drawn into the gaze of the state in that moment. So instead of an over-reliance on criminal law, how can democracy and political participation be expanded, along with pushing for more accountable, accessible, and humane legal systems? As recent attempts at violent insurrection in South Africa have so starkly shown, we in South Africa live in a society where the few are jostling for political power by capitalizing on the social and economic marginalization of the many. And this is not unique to South Africa. And so in those contexts, I think it becomes particularly important to be looking at anti-violence strategies that are anchored in the rule of law, and that also counter this risk of being co-opted into a logic of mass incarceration, of militarization, and ultimately of state violence. So whilst the tendency now is to push for tougher laws, I think, as others have said, we need other responses, ones that are economic and political, not only legal, and ones that take into account the social and historical conditions that continue to fuel violent othering. This, of course, includes centering the well-being of victims and providing alternative forms of redress, because, of course, redress for individuals as well as for collectives is indeed critical. And then finally, I think there's value in reframing our anti-violence work around concepts like community safety and well-being as an alternative to crime, control, and punishment. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Melanie. It is indeed an invigorating discussion, and I'm very much appreciating all of your feedback. And I want to turn back to Jason. Jason, you've been engaged in these debates on hate crimes in the United States, and I'm curious about how, in your work, whether you are engaging with these conversations globally. How do the conversations intersect? Or are these just local issues that need to be looked at in a particular context in the United States? And I'm thinking about this question in a self-critical way, in that at Human Rights Watch, we have often urged governments like the United States to take things like US models of hate crimes legislation and offer them as policy, potential policy reforms in other countries that don't have hate crimes legislation. So, thinking very critically about whether that's the kind of influence we want the US to have, or what the US could learn from other struggles and other approaches. Can you share some thoughts?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think obviously local struggles are tied to global struggles, and that there's so many connections to be made, but at the same time, There are very different contexts, and so I think that we have to be careful with how we're doing that. I want to reference the work of Julian Uggen, who is a queer and indigenous Chamorro writer from Guam, who wrote a new book called The Properties of Perpetual Light earlier this year. And he talks about the indigenous struggle for self-determination and how that's a struggle that overlaps with the fight against militarization, colonization, climate destruction, and predatory global capitalism. And I wanted to reference his work because earlier this year I had a conversation with him, and we were talking about precisely these connections between the demands to defund the police to the demand to defund the Pentagon. And I think that there's a lot of connections between these local struggles and also US imperialism and colonization and militarization abroad. And both of these demands to defund are really about reprioritizing and reallocating funds and resources to life-affirming services and institutions instead of life-destroying systems. And so, this is a panel that's about hate crimes and criminalization, but there are obviously connections to other crises, including the climate crisis, and so forth. And so I wanted to bring in Julian Uggen's work into this conversation as well, and I encourage everyone to read his book. Angela Davis, she calls these kind of connections intersectional solidarity, where we're bringing struggles together to end systems of oppression and exploitation across national borders. And so I also want to reference her work, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, as another kind of guiding post for me in how I think about these issues. And so with the remaining time that I have, I also want to uplift another name and story that I think is relevant to this conversation, and that is Jennifer Laudy. In 2014, Jennifer Laudy, a Filipino trans woman, was killed by US Marine Scott Pemberton, who was stationed in the Philippines at Subic Bay, which used to be the largest US naval base overseas. Laudy was found in a motel bathroom unconscious. Her life was stolen by Corporal Pemberton after he discovered she was transgender. Laudy was a sex worker and the primary breadwinner for her family. She was 26 at the time. Later, Pemberton was tried for a crime and was found guilty of homicide. I wanted to share her story because I think it highlights how crime is a political project that powerful people, institutions like the military, and nations like the United States harm, exploit, and inflict violence all the time. We just don't punish them when they do it. And I also want to, tie that to the conversation earlier, that so much of the harm and violence that queer and trans people experience is very much legalized and legitimated through the state. And so in Jennifer Laudy's case, it's tied to imperialism, colonialism, and militarism. But also in the United States, we are seeing dozens of legislatures pass anti-trans laws, excluding children from sports, denying trans children access to healthcare. And so these are forms of violence and discrimination that are legalized and legitimated through the state. And none of the criminal legal system even attempts to address any of this, right? And these are separate conversations that are happening. The last thing I wanted to say is that I think that the legal system is one tool to address discrimination and violence, but I think we have to talk about supporting social movements, Black and brown trans-led organizations that are organizing and building these movements, and censoring the people that are most directly impacted. And that does not always mean lawyers and policy makers and the quote unquote experts in the room. And so I also want to talk about how part of the solution has to be building grassroots social movements and supporting directly impacted communities and putting money where our mouth is to support those organizations and communities to do that work. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Jason. And finally, I want to turn back to Estefania to discuss a little bit the possibility of using civil penalties as an alternative to criminal penalties in addressing some of the types of violence and discrimination that we're dealing with. Can you reflect a bit on the benefits and limitations of civil penalties as an alternative approach? Does this escape some of the concerns that everyone here has expressed about criminal law being a tool that provides the state with more punitive power and more opportunities to violate human rights? And are there other alternatives that advocates might want to take into consideration in thinking about how to actually stem violence in a human rights respecting way?
Yes, it's I'll try to be quick, but again, starting with the fact that violence happens and we need to do something about it, you know? And many occasions, so you need procedures, systems, ways of talking about it, you know? Within the state, and this goes back to Jason's own point, it's the state is not the only response. And I think a lot of us are generally addressing harm in our lives without state intervention. And I think the most critical feminists, so all the feminists, which are generally women of color working on transformative justice, it's this idea that even that we have entirely given justice to the state, but justice is something that you build on day to day in your relationships. But within the state, there's civil law, there's labor law, there's administrative law, there's a whole bunch of other laws, once you start digging into it, that could help you address a variety of issues depending on the context in which you are at. I think one of the most interesting and different aspects is that criminalization, criminal law, is generally made up to punish individual physical persons, while civil law, labor law, it is meant to even punish, but for example, companies, institutions. And I think that shift is not minor. Generally, if you look at discrimination, even if you look at violence, they are practices that are upheld, even fostered by institutions. Within the military, and in Mexico, we also have a slight problem of militarization, was that it's not rogue soldiers that execute. It's a strategy. It's literally the institution. So imprisoning soldiers is not a solution. The solution would be get the military off the streets, for example. So I think a part of if you're interested in exploring state solutions, where our view needs to be is in these other systems. And another thing that I think that is important, there's very little data, but one of the things that we have discovered through state public data is, for example, when women are asked, did you live violence in school? Yes. Did you denounce it? Yes. Where did you go to? The majority is my own school, my own workplace. So there's also this idea like this is what victims want. Victims want criminal law. And if you look at what little data there is, it's like, that's not necessarily true. Now, if women are going to their school, if women are going to their workplace, the question is, what law regulates the workplace, the school place? And it's not criminal law. So I think, again, just trying to give arguments like this entire idea of victims want criminal law. And if you actually talk to, in this case, women, it's like not all of them, not always. And criminal law is not good for these other necessities, these other needs. The other advantage I would say about systems of law that are not criminal law is that since they can turn to imprisonment, they have to get creative. And you have to start giving other type of solutions that don't end up with put X person in prison for 10, 20, 50 years. And we're starting to see, for example, resolutions in family law that address family violence, that try to, it's like, there's this amazing case of a trans girl, and her father is a transphobe who makes her change clothes And the judge is like, dude, sir, you cannot do that. And the response is not imprison him, which nobody wants. It's how do you show that man that he is harming his daughter? And what tools do you give him to actually treat his daughter in the way she deserves? Also, again, these are some examples of different ways that you could show them. I'm sure there's a ton of other problems with these laws, but one key difference to me is the harm that they do is not the equivalent of people being in prison for 20, 30, 50 years or people being killed by the military. So I think I'm more comfortable addressing the harms of these other systems of law. So again, just some alternatives, and thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Estefania. Unfortunately, I have to bring this wonderful conversation to a close. I feel like we could probably continue talking all day. This has been a very eye-opening conversation, and fortunately, we'll have the chance to continue the conversation with live questions from audience members at the 2021 Copenhagen Human Rights Conference in August. So once again, thank you so much for participating. Thank you all for the incredible work that you're doing every day. And I look forward to opportunities to continue the discussion. Thank you.